Hey AP Eagles, big moment here. This is our last review video that I will be posting, at least as far as content goes, before your AP exam on Friday, May 15th at 2 p.m. We're going to be looking at finishing Unit 7 right now. We're going to do pages 27, 28, and 29. That will officially finish off your AP review notebooks. Remember, you should work on studying these over the next couple days and reviewing what you wrote down on all these pages, keeping that information fresh in your minds. But obviously, you guys can also have this next to you as you are typing out or handwriting out your AP DBQ essay on Friday. So use this also as a resource because you did all this good research. You guys should plan on using it to get some extra points for outside information, contextualization, those kinds of things. Also, don't forget to make sure that you do the AP exam day experience and demo. All right, I put that lesson up on Teams for you guys. Please make sure that you practice going through the steps of not only taking the test, but submitting the essay. I don't want you guys to run into a situation on Friday where you're confused by what you see. If you do that demo ahead of time and you go through all the steps, then you'll know exactly what you guys need to do on Friday when you take the test and submit the test. All right. With that being said, let's jump right into it. I'm going to go quick today because, again, these are topics that we actually just covered a few weeks ago, and you guys should still have your note packets on these topics. And you can obviously use those as a resource as well while you're taking the AP exam. But I will tell you guys this. I don't think these are going to be the topics. All right. Doesn't mean that we shouldn't cover them. We got to cover our bases. But I don't think they're going to give you guys a DBQ essay topic on something that's so late in the year. I think they're going to aim for something more towards the middle of AP US history. Just my thought. We'll see what happens on Friday. Here we go. Page 27 was the Roaring Twenties. And one of the things I wanted you guys to keep in mind about the Roaring Twenties is just sort of the overall mood of this time period, okay? Remember, we've just come out of World War I, victorious on the side of the Allies, but sort of shaken up by World War I. Remember, our foreign policy will focus more on being isolated and focusing more on ourselves. And what that's going to lead to during the Roaring Twenties is a whole bunch of cultural shifts and also some economic changes as well. But I want to focus mainly on the cultural shifts for the Roaring Twenties. And when we talk about the cultural shifts, what we're really talking about is after World War I, there's going to be this shift from sort of the old traditional values of America to sort of a new, more youthful American culture. Okay, so you sort of have old versus new, right? Young versus old, science versus modern and technology, religion versus more modern and non-religious ideas. So there's different ways to say this, but that's what we're referring to when we talk about the cultural shift during the 1920s. So to go with the bullet points, describe U.S. consumerism after World War I. Remember, the Roaring Twenties is a time period of rapid economic expansion. The unfortunate part about this is we know at the end of the 1920s is when we're going to hit that stock market crash and Great Depression. But in the Roaring Twenties, the economy is taking off. And people felt like this was going to be this time period of success, economic growth that was going to last forever and ever and ever. And people were buying as we had never seen before. Second bullet point talks about the cultural shift taking place after World War I. Well, we already talked about it. It's the old versus the new, the old versus the young, the religious traditional values versus the modern values. So if you guys are looking for examples of that, it brings up flappers. All right, perfect example. Women are acting differently. There's a cultural shift specifically for women during this time period. Flappers are the best example of that. Young women going out, wearing more revealing clothing, drinking and smoking in public, dancing at clubs, sort of challenging those old, more traditional conservative views of what women should look like and what they should be doing from before the 1920s. But during the 1920s, women are sort of liberating themselves, specifically young women, and really pushing the boundaries like we had never seen before. So flappers is a perfect example. Sports and entertainment is going to be growing at this time. Again, it shows that whole focus on consumerism, spending money, living in the moment. In the 1920s, people are spending less time at work and have more money to spend on their free leisure time, because if they're not at work, they're looking to be entertained, and people are going to movies, people are going to theaters and museums, people are also going to sporting events. We have famous athletes like Babe Ruth for baseball and Jack Dempsey for boxing, and these are the kinds of things that people were spending their money on. Going to a club, listening to jazz music, which will be part of the Harlem Renaissance, which we'll talk about here too in just a second. The Scopes trial, another perfect example of the cultural shift taking place at this time. When we talk about the Scopes trial, remember, it's really getting back to that idea of old religious traditional values versus more modern and new scientific ideas. Remember, John Scopes is the guy that taught about evolution in his Tennessee high school science class. And he did it on purpose. He knew that he was breaking the law, but he wanted to challenge that law because he thought, this is an old, outdated idea. It's science. It should be right to be able to teach these theories in school. It's not a bad thing. And he ends up losing the case. And he ends up having to pay like $100 fine, which he never paid because people paid it for him because it was a publicity stunt. But the Scopes trial, the reason that it's important as a court case is not really the outcome, it's the idea. It captures what the Roaring '20s was about, challenging those old traditional authorities in this new, more modern, more scientific America. Okay? One more thing that I would throw in there, because I'm realizing now, I'm just looking at the page here, that I must have forgot the Harlem Renaissance. I have it in my other notes, and I forgot to put in your bullet points. So you guys have to add that to the Roaring '20s. Harlem Renaissance is major, major stuff, right? Harlem Renaissance is the whole concept of the celebration of African American culture and heritage. You guys know that during World War I, we have the Great Migration, and we have millions of African Americans settling in northern cities. And because they're going to experience more freedom than they had under the control of the South after the Civil War, this is an opportunity for African Americans to celebrate their history, their heritage, and their culture, and their artistic and creative abilities. You have the Jazz Age during this time, and you have musical artists like Duke Ellington. You have writers like Langston Hughes, right? And remember, what a lot of times the music and the writing, what it did is it took the history of African Americans, what they had experienced from slavery and through the years to where they have come. And it's sort of a celebration of what they have endured up to this point and what the future might hold, and the future is bright and those sorts of ideas. So this Harlem Renaissance is a great time period as far as a minority group of people who previously, as we know in history, have just been pushed down, a time period of celebration and of growth for African Americans. Okay? Your last bullet point there is nativism. Remember, nativism, we've already talked about the fear of immigrants, the fear of radical foreign ideas. What happens after World War I is an event known as the Red Scare, red symbolizing communism. Remember, during World War I is when the Russian Revolution took place and Russia became the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union is the first communist country in the history of the world. So this Red Scare, this fear that immigrants and their foreign ideas like communism might infiltrate into the United States and infiltrate into the U.S. government. And that's what the Red Scare was all about. It's this hysteria, this fear associated with it. And of course, oftentimes when fear like that takes place, people will overreact and the government will exceed its normal powers, right? And we saw that during the case of Sacco and Vanzetti, right? That famous case where those Italian immigrants are convicted of robbery and murder, and they ultimately would be put to death. And what we've come to find out is that there wasn't nearly the evidence to prove that they were guilty, and in fact, they probably weren't guilty. But it shows that fear, that impact that fear can have on people and how it causes us to act irrationally. Okay. Another thing that comes out of nativism of this time period is, of course, immigration reform, and that's where you guys get those quota acts that we talked about, right? It was a new concept with controlling immigration, setting quota limits on how many individuals can come from foreign countries each year. If you guys need to look up those quota acts of the early 1920s, go ahead and do that, okay? But that takes care of the Roaring 20s on page 27, so on to page 28, and that's where we get into the Great Depression, right? Unfortunately, the Roaring 20s and all the growth and all the positivity that did exist during this time period, remember, not all of it was nativism and that stuff, but there were a lot of great things happening during the Roaring 20s. Unfortunately, that's going to come to a crashing halt in 1929 when the economy collapses. And the first thing you guys need to know is the causes of the Great Depression. Remember, we covered those. It's really three major things. It's overproduction, right? Overproduction of goods threw off the whole balance in supply and demand. The supply got too high, the demand was low, and businesses ultimately found that they were overstocked with products that they couldn't even sell these for nothing. And then all of a sudden the profits are disappearing, right? Over speculation, right? We believed that the good times were going to continue to roll, and people were buying stocks and investing and doing all these things because they just thought that the market was just going to keep going up. But ultimately, we know that the economy always goes in waves, and eventually it was going to come down, but people over speculated, they overdid it. And they didn't see what was coming. And your last one is that whole buying on margin or buying stocks on credit, right? Buying stocks with money that you don't have. And when you don't actually spend money on these stocks, that ultimately means there is nothing to back these stocks and they're not really worth anything. This whole thing causes the Great Depression, the stock market crash to happen. When the stock market crashes take place, you have the run on banks, and the banks are closing. Total nightmare. People lost their jobs, lost their life savings, eventually lost their homes and all these things. Terrible, terrible event. President Hoover, so here's your next bullet point. His response to the Great Depression is patience. Now, President Hoover, he was an economic genius, and he did know that the economy did go in waves. He wasn't wrong for telling them that it's going to take patience. The economy will come back. He's right. It will come back. But unfortunately for the American people, they're suffering at this time, and they expect their government and their president to at least provide some sort of relief for them so that they can find their way through this Great Depression. And they didn't feel like Hoover did that. Remember, there's examples of that. The Bonus Army, remember the Bonus Army marches to Washington, World War I veterans looking for their bonus pay from the war. And when the government says no, they set up those Hoovervilles, and then the military comes in and attacks them. And it's just this whole mess. You know, what a terrible, terrible event when you have your current military attacking veterans of your military for basically wanting help, wanting their bonuses from their government. You could talk about the Hoovervilles, and you could talk about the Hoover blankets. Remember, that's what homeless people covered themselves with newspapers on park benches, and they called those Hoover blankets to sort of throw it in President Hoover's face that he wasn't doing enough for the American people. So the election of 1932 rolls around. Hoover, of course, is going to lose this election because Franklin Roosevelt, right, a politician for the Democrats, he is going to emerge. And he's going to offer people the relief that they wanted, right? And that's what he talked about in his campaign. We talk about the 3 R's of FDR's New Deal programs: relief, recovery, and reform. And those are big, big time stuff. Remember that when FDR comes into office, we have that famous first 100 days where FDR is going to pass more legislation through Congress than any president ever had in his first 100 days, providing that action that people wanted. He did those fireside chats to try to get people to take a deep breath and relax and let them know that he was on the job and that positive things were happening, right? There's a bunch of New Deal programs. Remember, try to have like 2 or 3 in your back pocket, put them in your notes here, whichever ones you want to put in there. The Agricultural Adjustment Act, Social Security, whichever ones you guys want. You can quickly look those up, but know some of those programs. Remember, the goal is the relief, recovery, and reform. Be able to describe those 2 or 3 that you pick for yourself so you can give those details in your essays that you're looking for. Of course, there's going to be critics, right? People that are going to look at FDR and they're going to say, you are over exceeding your presidential power. You are expanding the power of the federal government. And FDR is not going to apologize for that. Remember, the United States is in a moment of crisis. He believes that in these moments of crisis, the government must do whatever is necessary and proper to protect the American people, and he says that this is right. Unfortunately, some of his New Deal programs will be found unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, and that's part of that bullet point. How did the Supreme Court respond to some of these New Deal programs? The Supreme Court would declare some of his programs unconstitutional. FDR didn't like that. So FDR is going to try that famous court packing scheme, try to increase the number of Supreme Court justices, positions that he would fill as president, and the idea is that he was going to fill them with people that supported his programs. And if he got enough people in the Supreme Court, enough justices in there, they would stop declaring his New Deal programs unconstitutional. Now, that never happens, all right? That's never passed through Congress. But it did send a strong message to the Supreme Court where FDR was like, hey, leave my programs alone. This is good for the American people. And again, the Supreme Court would declare a few of his programs unconstitutional, but many of them would stay, especially ones like Social Security, which still exists to this day, the longest lasting of the New Deal programs. Okay? Your last bullet point there is, what impact did World War II have on the Great Depression? And guys, the answer is that it ended it, right? Know that FDR's New Deal programs did not end the Great Depression. They did not solve the Great Depression. What they did is they made the Great Depression bearable. He was able to provide enough relief to get America through it, right? But it was World War II that ends the Great Depression, because with World War II, we'll see this uptick in production because we got to supply the militaries in Europe, and then all of a sudden the Great Depression is over because business is back. Okay. Finally, your last one, guys, page 29. So turn that last page. An exciting moment for us here. Your final page of review materials. I did want to make sure that we covered interwar foreign policy. Remember, we've seen a little wave in our foreign policy. We had Washington and we had the Monroe Doctrine be our foreign policy all the way through the 1800s. Avoid foreign entanglements, avoid foreign alliances, be more isolated, be more neutral. And then the Spanish-American War happened in 1898. And then our foreign policy under Teddy Roosevelt in the early 1900s of being an international police force and being more active in foreign affairs. But then we got involved in World War I, and after World War I, we revert back to the original foreign policy. World War I scared us, and it was at that point where we said, maybe avoiding foreign entanglements, avoiding alliances, and being isolated was the way to go. So we go back to what we used to be before the Spanish-American War in 1898. All right? The bullet points. The League of Nations. You guys know that was part of Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. It was that world organization that was going to rely on international cooperation to solve disputes between countries. And it was Woodrow Wilson's key idea that he got into the Treaty of Versailles. Excuse me. And when he brought the Treaty of Versailles back to the Congress, back to the U.S. Senate, they said no. They didn't want to join the League of Nations because it would have kept us involved in other countries' affairs. It would have made us an interventionist country. And we don't want to be an interventionist country. We want to be an isolationist country at this time. So Congress and the Senate pushes for isolationism. We don't join the League of Nations. Eventually it becomes powerless to prevent future wars. Why did we choose it? Again, the idea is after World War I, the U.S. realizes they want to focus more on themselves and their own growth. and not be involved in other countries' affairs. That being an interventionist country oftentimes gets you pulled into other countries' conflicts and those responsibilities. And we didn't really want that, right? There's examples of some things that took place during this time that sort of prove that we didn't want to be involved. The Kellogg-Briand Pact was something we talked about, where countries agreed, let's just not use war anymore. We'll sign this agreement and war will never be used again as an instrument for foreign policy. It's a silly idea, right? You can't monitor that. You can't mandate that. It was a nice gesture, but it doesn't really mean anything, you know? Under FDR, remember, he passes, or his foreign policy, I should say, for Latin America becomes known as the Good Neighbor Policy. Remember, under Teddy Roosevelt, we were international police force and will intervene wherever necessary in Latin America. And look at how it changes. Under Franklin Roosevelt, it's the Good Neighbor Policy, basically saying, hey, the good neighbor minds his own business. So it shows that complete opposite of being involved and intervening. And no, we're going to stay on this side of our fence. That's what a good neighbor does, right? Good neighbors stay on their side of the fence. They stay on their property. They mind their own business. Those are examples of that shift in foreign policy that we see during the interwar period, okay? Finally, don't forget that we are creeping closer to World War II, and that's sort of where this ended for us this year. But as we creep closer to World War II, remember, you do have a couple of countries that are being particularly aggressive. Japan is being aggressive. They have a military dictatorship. They are imperializing and building a Japanese empire in Asia. And we don't like that. You know, you have Hitler in Germany and Mussolini in Italy, fascist dictators being aggressive throughout Europe, rearming their militaries, conquering land and imperializing. These are things that were not supposed to take place after World War I. But we see these countries starting to be aggressive. Now, initially, again, we're going to try to stay out of it. We stopped trading with Japan. We basically tell them, like, hey, if you're going to be aggressive, we don't want to be involved with you. So no more trade, right? And we stopped trading oil and scrap metal with them. It's part of the reason that they were mad enough at us that during World War I, they're going to do that secret invasion and attack us at Pearl Harbor. Eventually, our foreign policy does shift back. Once World War II starts, all of a sudden you start to see the shift back to being an interventionist, right? Because the Neutrality Acts are a perfect example of that. The first Neutrality Act came out in 1935. And then they came out every couple of years after that. And those first Neutrality Acts were all about, we're not going to trade with belligerent countries. If you are a country that is supporting war or involved in a war, we are not going to trade with you because we're going to mind our own business. We don't want to be involved with countries that are going to be aggressive like that. And we said that for those Neutrality Acts. And then all of a sudden, it shifts a little bit. Then it becomes, well, cash carry basis, right? They came up with this cash carry policy where, well, never mind, if you're at war, we will trade with you, but you have to come over here and get the goods and you have to pay in cash. And then all of a sudden it turns into the lend-lease policy where it was, hey, now you don't even have to pay us in cash. You can just come over here and borrow military goods if you need it. And remember, it was specifically aimed at helping the Allies. So even though we're saying we're neutral, we're very much choosing one side in World War II over the other, right? We are choosing the Allies over the Axis powers and sort of looking to help them with some of these policies. So you start to see that after 1939, when World War II starts, our policy of being non-interventionist and being more isolated, it starts to fade. And the United States will eventually become involved in World War II. And just like in World War I, our government during World War II will take a series of actions and steps to protect the country, oftentimes exceeding their federal power and raising questions about people's civil liberties and did they expand their power too much during this time of war. But guys, that's sort of where the course ends. It would be very unlikely that they would ask you guys any kind of question that's going to involve World War II because it's the last topic. Again, they're going to focus more, I would assume, somewhere in the middle of AP US history. If I had to guess, it's going to be somewhere around maybe the age of Jackson. Maybe it would go back as far as Jefferson, like early 1800s. and probably just go to the late 1800s. That's my guess. I'm going to say it's somewhere in the 1800s for you guys. We'll see. Got to be prepared for everything, though. I'm glad you guys have your notebooks that cover all the topics. Next couple days is all about studying, getting yourself mentally prepared. Remember that practice essay, the last one, is still posted for you guys in Teams. It's going to be up there all the way through Thursday. If you feel like you need to write another DBQ essay, you got to do that. Okay, don't leave that and go into the exam on Friday cold. I want you guys good and warmed up. Get that one last really solid essay practice so you guys feel really good going into the exam on Friday. Okay, message me, email me if you guys have any questions or anything like that. And obviously, I will be in touch here over the next few days. Okay, all the best to you guys. Remember, take care of yourself, but don't forget to be working. You know, last couple days here. Use this time the right way. Get yourself ready. Get yourself some college credit. Okay, we'll talk to you guys soon.